Today on This Week in Space, is NewSpace everything we're being told it is? The Cosmic Curmudgeon weighs in. Andy Aldrin is here.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is This Week in Space, episode number 14, recorded June 3rd, 2022, The Cosmic Curmudgeon. Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Space, the Cosmic Curmudgeon edition. Today we have the extreme pleasure of speaking with Andy Aldrin, NewSpace seer, former senior executive, United Launch Alliance, director of the Aldrin Space Institute, president of the Aldrin Family Foundation, professor and program chair for the Masters in Space Operations program at Embry-Riddle University, and yes, before you ask, the son of Buzz Aldrin. Hello, Andy. Thanks for joining us.
Rod, it's such a pleasure to be here. This is always fun talking with you.
Likewise. And we are joined by Tariq Malik, who is the editor-in-chief over at space.com. How you doing, Tariq? Good to see you again.
I'm doing well. Glad to see you after your globe-trotting adventures. So welcome back to Earth, Rod.
Yeah. So I just spent a week in Norway at an energy conference, which was an incredible honor. You may wonder why somebody like me would go to an energy conference. The answer is their theme was progressing towards net zero emissions, so they wanted to know all about innovation the NASA way. So I told them what I knew. And then, of course, after that, I spent a week in Washington, D.C. with the National Space Society's International Space Development Conference, which is a blast unto itself, and we'll talk more about that some other time because we have important things to talk about, such as a couple of jokes. So red alert for hilarity, stand by. Hey, Putin has boasted that Russia is planning to build a base on the moon when they were asked if they really wanted to spend the rest of their lives on a barren, lifeless, empty landscape. What do you think the cosmonauts said?
I'm not sure, Rob. What did they say?
No, that's why we want to go to the moon. Okay. Hey, does anybody remember when Neil Armstrong was doing his stand-up comedy routine?
No, I don't, actually.
He used to tell moon jokes. When nobody laughed, he'd pause and say, I guess you had to be there. All right, let's get out of this misery and move on to some headlines. First one we like to call Walking on the Moon. We should cue Sting and the police for this one. NASA has selected two companies to build its new spacesuits for use on the space station and, critically, on the lunar surface for the Artemis landings. The two companies are Collins Aerospace, working with ILC Dover, which is an established spacesuit maker. But the second award, which is a surprise to some of us, was Axiom Space. The award is $3.5 billion towards development of the suits. Purchases would be a separate package. And this is something that's been concerning people watching the Artemis program for a while, because the last time we built new spacesuits for NASA was in the early 80s, and the shuttle program is getting wound up. And the last time we built EVA suits for walking around the moon was about 1970, 1971. And those suits were built specifically for each astronaut, one use only, went to the moon, did their work, came back. And the longest they ever spent on the lunar surface was about 22 hours on Apollo 17, total EVA time. So there's a question here, which is, how do you build a moon suit that's A, modular and can be used by anybody, including women, which the existing suits haven't been a very good fit for, and B, how do you build a suit that's going to last a long time? Because those seals are critical, and moon dust is gritty, nasty stuff. So what do you know, Tariq?
Well, this is a really interesting announcement, because NASA has been developing their next generation spacesuit for decades. And this was one of the long poles in their tent to go to the moon, was the fact that A, they didn't have landers, which now they've contracted those out, and B, they didn't have suits for the astronauts to walk around in, despite all those decades of research over the last 10, 20 years or so. And this kind of solves that last question. It's surprising to me, just personally, that NASA has gone the full kind of private route for these suits, because this is a part of their commercial Artemis bent, rather than using all of the details and the knowledge they learned from, I think there's like a Z1 suit. There's like 5 or 6 different next gen suits that they've rolled out over the years. And these companies are going to build versions of what they've been working on already. So it is a separate line. It's interesting that they didn't say how much each company is getting. So I guess it's going to depend on what design they're going to be going for. If you want to build for the space station, which this does cover through 2034, you don't really need a lot of the kind of the grip and the footwear that you would need if you're going to be walking around craggy lunar regolith and rocks and whatnot. So that's going to be interesting to see how that develops. And then also if they're going to pick one or both for different uses, because they're leaving their options open with this contract to have them develop it. And the model is very similar to what we saw with commercial crew and commercial cargo.
And I guess one of the major goals is to make these things more mobility friendly. The Apollo suits are pretty stiff and difficult to work in. And anybody who's watched footage of the moonwalks has seen those guys fall over more than once. And it was tough getting back up. It was tough manipulating things. There are reports of blisters on their fingers from the use of the gloves. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of designs they come up with, sort of increase the mobility factor on these things.
Yeah, Dan Burbank, former NASA astronaut of Collins Aerospace. So there's a lot of NASA blood in these companies that are running. Mike Suffredini, a former NASA space station flight director, is over at Axiom Space. But Dan Burbank said that Collins Aerospace, their entry is they don't want it to feel like its own personal spaceship, which was long like this is what a spacesuit is. It's your own private spaceship. They want it to be a suit, something that you can move around in and adjust it even within a half an hour, is what he said during a press conference when NASA made this announcement. So that's really interesting. Also, because these are private companies, I'm wondering how they're going to market them to customers. Axiom Space wants to build their own private space station. They've already flown a private mission to the International Space Station. They've got plans for these spacesuits that aren't just for NASA, and that'll be interesting to look at too.
Yeah, and I was kind of surprised, and maybe I wasn't on the inside loop on this, but SpaceX has the same need for spacesuits for their flights, and all they've developed so far is a pressure suit, but they have developed a pressure suit that was approved for human use. And it was interesting that they weren't part of the package.
Yeah. I guess they didn't apply or NASA didn't like the price tag is what I take away from that. But they've also got to build their own suits for Starship when they get to the moon. And that might be part of that project as well.
All right. So next story, we're back to SLS again. We're going to see the rocket rolled out to the pad on June 6th for another attempt at a wet dress rehearsal for June 16th. What do you know?
Well, that's the big news, right? NASA still is targeting August, no earlier than, for the actual launch for Artemis 1. To do that, they need to get through this wet dress rehearsal. The space launch system with Artemis 1's been in the barn at the vehicle assembly building for the last month and a half since the April outing, and they feel like they've got a lot of the work on the structure, where they had like leaky valves and stuff, sorted and addressed. They were able to work on the launch tower when it was in the VAB. Now they're confident they've solved a lot of those issues. Now it is a big rocket, which means that they're limited by how much fuel they can get for the tests and whatnot. But they feel really confident now that they've addressed at least everything that they saw during that first run. It was interesting when they had a press conference NASA did on this earlier this month. Actually, it was in late May. They did say that while they've addressed all of those issues, they could find some new ones. So they're still testing everything. They want to leave their options open. And if you missed it, Rod, while you were traveling, NASA did put out an extremely detailed calendar for every time that Artemis 1 can launch in 2022, all the way through June of 2023. All these different windows that rely on, where the moon is in its orbit, how long it'll take for Artemis 1 to get there, etc. So they're clearly kind of mapping out all of their options if they can't make that August window. I'm not saying that they're not expecting to, but it was interesting that those were all of the Artemis 1 opportunities, and they went through June 2023.
You want to make another bet for that Star Trek chair?
I don't. I'm keeping my chair. I will bet you lunch or dinner. I'm gonna say. I think that August feels much more doable than, say, June did back in March when we were first talking about it. So I'm gonna say firmly end of August we'll see a show. So that's what I'm gonna stick my flag in there. My moon flag.
Okay, well, being the junior curmudgeon, I'm going to roll the dice into 2023, but I'm not going to say a date. All right, moving along. The NASA JPL announced that the Perseverance rover is using its onboard computer to select targets for SuperCam, which is the device that uses an optical camera to watch as a powerful laser zaps rocks that are further away from it than it can reach with one of its instruments, and is able to evaluate the spectra and so forth just by looking at the laser burn, which is pretty amazing technology already. But the news here is that they have now let the rover, when it ends a drive and arrives somewhere, assess targets around it. And if it sees something that looks like something it wants to know about, it uses its internal processors to select a target and go ahead and take readings and evaluate them, which only saves them about a day or two of round-trip radio time. But that's still a big deal, especially when you think about the fact that this rover is running on an old PowerPC chip that the design was baseline in about 1999. So I think that's pretty spectacular stuff. That's good programming.
Oh, yeah, it's good programming. It's also horrifying that NASA is allowing a robot on another planet to just shoot lasers at whatever it wants, right? So, I mean, that's what I took from this announcement from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. But, I mean, I'm going to, assume, that I'm going to roll the dice, like you said earlier, and that this is a benevolent robot overlord with Perseverance on Mars, and that it will pick interesting rocks that are scientifically valuable and not the only example of actual life on Mars and just be like, die. No, I don't think that's what it's going to do. But it's interesting how, you see this a lot with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory rovers, where they build it to do one thing, and then over time that they find different ways to enhance it. Now, Perseverance has not been on Mars for very long, and yet still they're already finding ways to optimize it a lot faster than when Curiosity, which, by the way, 10 years on Mars, Curiosity in August. So and they're still able to upgrade those systems too. So I think they're finding a lot of new kind of life hacks with these machines, and that they're building a lot of that flexibility in when they're constructing it, that gives them this power. So in the older models, you would use physical hardware that you couldn't upgrade with new software, like this new, they call it, I think I'm pronouncing it right, Aegis. It's the autonomous exploration for gathering increased science. That kind of sounds like they were trying to actually make the word Aegis and not not an acronym.
Make that force fit, right?
but it's interesting that they're able to build that flexibility to what they think they might want to do with something later into these vehicles at the design stage, because they're really thinking 10 years ahead at this point, because they had to lock all that down a good long time ago. I think that it bodes well for robot zapping on Mars. It bodes well for this increased science. NASA has always said that a human scientist could do more in an hour than a robot could do in a week or so, if not more, because they could just walk around and just pick up whatever. This is another step to getting robots to being able to do that.
Well, and just to put a light coda on your very dark thoughts, if we do see a couple of dead Marvin the Martians lying around after it's done, just think of the increase in planetary exploration budgets. That could be a big thing. All right. I think we've done it all.
To go rein in your renegade robot on Mars, right?
That's right.
Is that what you're saying?
All right, Gort, stand down. All right, we'll be back after a short break, so stand by. All right, now is the big moment. Let's hear the trumpets herald. We're going to be talking to the Cosmic Curmudgeon, trademark. And the key question here, we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff, but the key question that I think I want to ask is, we're all acting as if the NewSpace revolution has already occurred, that we're in the middle of this great thing, but you can't fool the Cosmic Curmudgeon. And you and I have talked about this a little bit, Andy. And I think the question, if I may paraphrase in boomer phraseology, is, where's the beef? Did we miss it? Are we stalled? What needs to occur? And also, what metric are we going to use to measure success in NewSpace? What do you think?
Well, so, the beef is measured in dollars and cents, right? And so at this point, the actual amount of money that's being invested, just as an example, the amount of money that's being invested in space hardware from private and commercial sources is still a small fraction of what the government invests. And so you've got tens of billions of dollars being invested, and that's great, but the governments combined are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on space right now. And so I think we need to see kind of balanced investment across the entire portfolio. So not just most of the money that's being invested right now is being invested in applications, which, frankly, look a lot like software rather than necessarily spacecraft. And so I think one of the things that I would like to see is more balanced investments across the three space economies, if you will. So there's a hardware economy, which are rockets and satellites and all the stuff we typically think about with space. There's ground systems, and then there's applications. And right now, applications kind of dominate in terms of commercial investment, which makes sense because space hardware is a tough investment for venture capitalists in particular, because it takes a long time to develop things. Profit margins in space hardware aren't that great typically. And there's a lot of technical risks to it. So one of the things I'm looking for would be to see more balance there. And then there are other things to just, let's see real activities. Let's see humans in space producing things in space that they can actually sell to someone, whether it's in space or on the ground. We're talking about it now, and that's all great stuff. But, I think when we start growing the beef in space is when and selling it to someone, I think that's the real answer.
Well, and I guess part of that, and leave it to me to come up with a simplistic question because I'm good at those. But right now we're spending money on Earth to get to space, to do things in space, to stay in space, International Space Station, now the Artemis program. Part of this, I guess, is when do we start seeing profits coming back from activities that are done up there, which is something we haven't seen yet, right?
Well, we do see a lot of profit coming from things like communication satellites and data being passed through those satellites. But when we start generating more data in space, like remote sensing, I'm super excited about the potential for remote sensing commercial data because we've got so many companies out there that are developing different types of data streams, from hyperspectral to actually measuring radio telemetry and providing sort of signals intelligence. That's going to be exciting when we start taking those data streams and putting them together into new information products that are going to do things we can't even think about right now. But we're not there yet. And that's kind of one of my points is we're dancing in the end zone, and I feel a little bit like Leon Lett from the Dallas Cowboys when he started dancing in the end zone and fumbled the ball through the end zone, and the Buffalo Bills ended up getting the ball back on a touchback. So we've got to be a little bit careful about dancing before we're in the end zone.
That's great.
Can I follow that? Because when I think about NewSpace, Andy, and maybe when a lot of our listeners do too, they think of private rockets. They think of SpaceX, maybe Blue Origin, maybe Virgin Galactic. They think of like the flashy things that they see actually leaving the planet. And when you think about that, we had in this century alone, you had 10 years plus in the United States with the space shuttle, and then a lot of nothing in terms of like human spaceflight, but you still had a lot of commercial rockets flying, and then you see things like the reusable rockets that SpaceX and Blue Origin have developed. Their plans for even bigger rockets. There's a lot of visibility that the public is seeing when it comes to what's going on now that maybe we didn't see in the earlier days of the space industry. So they would just say, wow, things are just amazing now. I guess that's what this is. But it sounds like from what you were saying earlier, that this is kind of like scratching the surface, that there's a lot more infrastructure behind it that really needs to be built out. Is that what I'm getting, I guess, from this? Or do I?
That's a part of it. But let's talk about, right now we're in sort of the third wave of space commercialization, but we've done this twice before. We did it when we started flying the shuttle. I mean, remember, the shuttle was going to fly 50 times a year at a cost of $8 million a flight. Okay, we kind of missed that bogey.
It didn't?
But we kind of missed that cost bogey. But interesting things happened. For example, the first completely commercial launch vehicle. Conestoga was developed during that time frame. You had Max Vijay with the Industrial Space Facility, which was really cool, and it almost got off of the ground. Cool things happened, but then you had Challenger in a single event, kind of took down the commercial space economy. And then we did it again in the late 90s. And we were going to darken the sky with Iridium and Global Star, and you had Teledesic, which was run by Bill Gates, or at least funded by Bill Gates, and we were going to darken the sky with satellites. And then you literally had one event again, which was the failure of Iridium, because they made some really bad business decisions. It wasn't because their satellites weren't doing what they were supposed to do. They just picked the wrong markets and did some dumb things. But it took the entire commercial space industry down for the most part, at least in terms of VC investment. What's different today, and even the Cosmic Curmudgeon has reasons for optimism. What's different today is the institutional framework, the financing, the human capital, things like that are so much more robust than they were. I don't think a single event will take down the commercial space industry, although obviously falling into another recession would not be a good thing for commercial investment. But I think you've got companies like SpaceX that have such a solid financial basis for them right now well, at least they have a lot of money. I can't for the life of me get to $130 billion valuation for SpaceX, but it's different. It's different now in that I don't think we're dependent on single companies, single events. There's a lot that's going on, and I actually think, we may be in for a bit of a rough patch, but I think the companies that come out of it are going to be incredibly strong. And we are going to, when we come out of this wave, I think we really will have a strong commercial space industry, but we're not there yet.
Well, I had three examples I wanted just to ask you about, kind of exactly to what you were talking about, because in 2014 we had a horrible first week of November where you saw a Northrop Grumman, I guess it's Northrop Grumman, but then it was Orbital Sciences, where they lost an Antares cargo rocket to the space station. It blew up over here in Virginia. By the end of that week, actually, I guess it was the last week of October, because it was Halloween, you had the Virgin Galactic, the fatal accident, where they lost a pilot tragically. And then, you fast forward, Russia loses a Progress cargo ship in the months that followed, and then SpaceX later that the next year in May or June of 2015, they lost a whole rocket of NASA cargo. So you had that was the launch one. They launched in 2016. They lost another customer.
They lost one on the pad, right?
On the pad, yeah. And I had thought at each one of those accidents, although we had seen the issues on the Russian side with the boosters kind of prolific at that time, that those companies were going to not be able to get back from those events. And yet, here we are now in Virgin Galactic. They lost some reservations, but they did launch at least one crewed flight. They've got a new contest to people that have Land Rovers, I guess, to qualify, and they've got people lined up. You have Blue Origin. Didn't have those issues. They did destroy a rocket during a launch, but nothing to what we've seen in the active flights themselves. But by the end of that year, 2015, SpaceX did come back and launch another Falcon 9 and resume all of their flights and kind of tick those boxes. And that showed, I guess, an early resilience for this kind of, I'm going to do air quotes so no one can see me, of the new space at that point in time, that I think gets taken for granted now. But it sounds like you're saying that we're not out of the woods yet.
We're not, but those events, I think, kind of encapsulate what I'm talking about. Space tourism had legitimacy, and so the people that had signed up to fly for Virgin Galactic believed that this was going to happen and really were committed to doing this because they thought it was a legitimate activity. And with SpaceX, you had NASA that was absolutely supportive of them. And so, as I said, that the underlying institutional kind of cloud of people, of investors, continued to support it. SpaceX continued to get investment money during that time. And I don't know that the overall space community was as robust before as it certainly as it is now. So I think that's one of the reasons that that you can be optimistic about the future of this. But it's probably not going to happen as fast as everybody thinks it's happened. Most of my students believe it's already happened, and that the revolution is done. It was televised, and so one of the things that distinguishes great entrepreneurs isn't just that they take risks, because they do, because they do things that the Cosmic Curmudgeon would not do, but they understand the environment and they understand the markets, and that's one of the most important things that leads to successful entrepreneurship. It's also one of the things that leads to failures. If you don't know your customers and you don't know the environment that you exist in, it can be a problem, because most businesses start out with plan A and end up on plan B, and you don't get the right plan B unless you really know what the landscape looks like.
Well, and you bring up some of your students. We talked in the past about your students, and you had mentioned to me that you get some great final papers talking about things like the multi-quintillion dollar asteroids that are solid platinum in some people's minds and so forth, although surely not your students. They're smarter than that. But there's a lot of optimism there about things like asteroid mining. But it's all in Tomorrowland. We've seen a couple of companies come and go that were going to take it on, and very little happened there. Is it inevitable? Is it likely? Is there real value to bringing this material back to Earth, or should it just be used where it is in space?
I think bringing it back to Earth is always going to be a tough one, because the transportation costs are just so high. I mean, how much does it cost to mine a ton of iron, or even a ton of platinum? The costs are very low when you compare it to the cost of space transportation. And so that's always going to be a tough one. I do think that there is an in-space market, and I think it's more likely to be resources coming from the moon. So, for example, if space-based solar power, there are arguments one way or the other about the technology of it, but let's just accept for the moment that the technology works, will require them. I mean, the real economic problem has always been just getting all of that mass into geo. But if you're taking that mass off of the moon, it becomes a very different problem. I mean, in some ways, solving the problem of Earth to orbit launch is all about launching from the moon instead of the Earth. And so I think that utilization of extraterrestrial resources in space could make a lot of sense. And I think it's probably going to come from the moon before it's going to come from asteroids.
Well, and to that point, and then I'm going to let Tariq ask another question, because I'm sure he's burning with a bunch of them. What do you think a gallon of lunar water is going to be worth? I mean, on one hand, it's worth 3 cents, which you've got it in your hand because water's cheap. On the other hand, given the cost of launching, I think a gallon of water weighs 8 pounds or something, which is, right. There's a lot of ways of looking at it, but maybe $40,000 per gallon to launch it. What's that worth? And to peg that price, does somebody like the U.S. government have to set up a commodity exchange and promise to pay a certain amount of money for that water because of all the things you can do with it?
I think you've hit on exactly the right milestone, if you will. We know what the value of a kilogram of water on the moon is. It is $1 less than what it would cost you to transport that to wherever you need it to be from Earth. And so we have a price point, and I think we will have reached an incredibly important milestone when NASA when somebody, but it's more likely to be NASA than anyone else, issues a contract to a company for a meaningful amount of propellant purchased at some point in space. Just call it L1. It's probably going to have to be something like 100 tons a year or something like that. When you see that contract and you see a company willing to take on that contract at a fixed price, then I think we've made real progress, and we will have made real progress when that company starts selling it to NASA at a profit. And that is when I think the extraterrestrial economy will have arrived.
Okay, Tariq, I lied. I have one more question. Pursuant to that, a couple years ago, NASA set up a contracting situation, I guess you'd call it, where they told some of these NewSpace companies, hey, if you get to the moon and grab a thimbleful of lunar soil, we'll pay you for it. And I think it was $25,000 a gram or something, which is kind of interesting because it's sort of like throwing your spear in the ground and saying, here we are, this is ours. We're establishing that this is worth something and that it can be bought and sold and traded and so forth. Was that a major accomplishment, or was it just a blip on the radar?
A blip on the radar. I mean, it's a nice thing to do, but it's got to be an economically meaningful amount of propellant or something that NASA's buying, that it's not just sort of a one-off trick that you can do. And something else to recognize that does trouble me a little bit is we don't do a very good job of balancing risk between government and industry. And part of that is industry's fault, is that industry will willingly, delightfully take on massive amounts of risk just to get some market share of an unprofitable market. And we've gotten it right a few times. And we certainly got the risk balance very, very, very much right in the case of cargo resupply to the space station. That was a really good program. But then if you look at things like the original EELV program, we had that completely honked up. And then we had it honked up in the sense that industry took on too much risk and then government took on too much risk. And now we sort of have it in the right place. Commercial Crew is an interesting one. CLIPS is interesting. But I do worry about government industry negotiations, which end up with really unbalanced outcome, because if you have an unbalanced outcome, ultimately the program's going to suffer. And I think we need to pay a lot of attention to understanding the balance of risk, not just each party trying to get the best deal out of the other one, to rip off the other side, because it isn't going to work well. And the other thing is, commercial industry is really lousy at assessing risk.
That's an interesting point.
Well, I wanted to ask about that tipping point again, especially like using Andy, using that example about having a contract for something and a lot of something that then the companies can make a profit at. We've seen a few examples just from the International Space Station. There was a company made in space who started making Z-band optical fiber on the International Space Station. They started printing it. They printed metal. But I haven't seen like a pipeline yet for those products on Earth. And is it because there isn't the infrastructure for actual manufacturing yet to get to where in space where when I read science fiction, I read a lot of Ben Bova, and they're talking about these automated factories that are making like giant television screens and then somehow getting them down to Earth without them breaking in auto factories at L1 or whatever. But clearly the International Space Station isn't that. Neither would be its immediate sequel. But Axiom Space, who just won this spacesuit contract, I mean, that's a spacesuit product that they're going to be building that they can then use for their own customers for private flights. Is there a trade-off, I guess, between that materials manufacturing, propellant, goods, services, or the benchmark technology that will set up kind of the future infrastructure, the software for that automated factory in space? I guess I'm not sure where we are in that technological evolution.
Yeah. So
to get to that sci-fi future.
There are lots of pieces to that question. And so I think if you want to talk about the idea of making things in space and selling them on the Earth, the first thing to think about is just a cost breakdown. And so we know to transport something to the space station and get it back down, you're talking at least sort of $5,000 a kilogram. So whatever you produce has to be worth a lot more than $5,000 a kilogram, or nobody will buy it. And then on top of that, you have the cost of operating whatever production facility it is that's producing that in space. And right now, space station sells things at an artificially low price because they're not charging the full freight for what it takes to build something in space. Because with the space station is it's probably in excess of $1 billion a year program, exclusive of transportation. So you've got to be able to produce something that's worth more than what it costs to just spend that time in space, and astronaut time and machine time and power and all those kinds of things. And it's a big number. And so it's going to be hard to compete with things that are developed terrestrially, unless there's some qualities of the product that you're producing that that can absorb what's a very high cost of production and transportation, if you will. But if you compare that to a buyer in space, the transportation costs and lots of the operational costs are already on their books, so to speak. And so if they can get it for cheaper than what it takes them to build it and bring it up from the Earth, it's going to be a good deal for them. So that's why I think space production will be much more competitive to space customers than it's going to be to Earth-based customers.
So that means we need to wait till we have a settlement on the moon, or 3 or 4, where they can all have a market, I guess, like
it's not.
They can have fire sales for moon water and whatnot.
It's not going to happen soon, but I can see it happen. Whereas a lot of things that we talk about, I don't really see a clear pathway to get there. But I can see that happening with lunar-based resources. But it is a huge endeavor. It's going to be massively expensive, and it's going to involve some really delicately balanced partnerships between government and industry to make it work. And developing those partnerships may be the most important part of it. And I'm not convinced we're really that good at it yet. I think we've gotten lucky.
So I've got an elephant in the room question coming up, but first, let's take a break. We'll resume our long SLS countdown after this short message. Andy, with Starship coming online, we hope soon, we're going to have this massive conveyor belt open, assuming it flies at any kind of frequency, of 100 plus tons to orbit and ultimately to the moon, going up, and then presumably some percentage of that coming back. Unless we start stacking 40 lead rovers in each of these starships, what mass is going to take up that incredible payload capacity? Because I don't see it yet.
Well, I mean, that's a big question. Well, I think near term is clear enough that the Starlink constellation is going to require a huge amount of mass going up, and the recent articles talking about the satellites doubling in size helps, and he can make bigger, more powerful satellites, and that'll require more mass. But the amount of mass that Starship could theoretically lift at the rates that SpaceX has talked about, 50 launches a year, is a little bit mind-boggling, to be honest with you, because it's, literally you could launch as much mass into space in about 3 years as humanity has launched since the beginning of time. You could, the kind of baseline up mass requirement for the world, if you take out constellations for the moment, is it 450 tons or so, something like that, and Starship could launch that in 3 launches if they're doing 150 tons. And so it does create real questions about where is the market going to come from? And it's not just about making bigger, heavier rovers and things like that go to the moon. That seemed a little bit like an afterthought. It really is another one of the cases of if you build it, the market will come. But until it does, SpaceX has still got something north of 9,000 employees, and you have to pay for them. And so the cost of Starship, or Falcon 9 for that matter, are very much a function of launch rates and hopefully launch rates from paying customers. And so if the number of Starship launches falls to something like 2 or 3 a year, it gets to be massively expensive. If you're launching 50 a year, it's a $30 million launch, and it's beautiful. We don't know where those launches come from. I mean, they may, but we don't have a basis of payloads that are out there. In fact, you could look at Starship launching all of the constellations, including not just Starlink, but Kuiper and everybody else that's out there. And it's not going to take them very long to launch all of those. And once you launch the constellations, what's next? The replenishment rates will be pretty low. So it is a massive gamble. The interesting thing is the only market out there that could sustain Starship is probably NASA. And so if Starship replaces SLS, maybe it makes sense, as NASA buying 2 or 3 launches, but then that's only 2 or 3 out of 50 launches, right?
Is the SpaceX model? SpaceX says that they've sold at least 2 of Starship separate from NASA right now. They've got the Japanese businessman Yusaku Misawa's flight around the moon, if that's actually going to happen in the next year or two. They've got the Polaris Dawn program, or the Polaris program mission, maybe at the end of the year. We don't know when they're going to launch their first crewed flight.
Right.
But is that's a model that we've seen now with space? They used it with Dragon already, with Axiom Space, and with their Inspiration mission. Does that set them up a bit ahead in terms of this market, where they're starting to diversify pretty early? It does seem that they've used a lot of the funding they may have gotten for those trips around the moon, these private flights, to feed back into the program itself to build, the many different models. But we haven't seen, I should point out, Rod, we haven't seen a Starship launch in over a year. So a prototype, because they've got issues with FAA, they've got issues on their own building the engines. They don't have enough of the new Raptors to power it. So I'm just wondering about those two different split programs, because NASA is clearly an anchor customer for the moon. SpaceX seems to have other issues. It seems like they want to get to where that's their core rocket, is the Starship by that point.
Right. Well, I mean, if they've sold 2 missions, 48 to go. And I mean, my real question is,
when you put it like that, it's very clear what the problem is. So,
well, I mean, if they're launching 2 missions a year, they're going to be $300 million missions or something like that. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you've got 9,000 people. You've got to pay them X amount of dollars, and you've got some amount of money coming in from Falcon 9. But a Starship is going to replace Falcon 9, and you just look at the business. If it's vertically integrated, the numbers are pretty simple. And so somehow or another, you have to pay for those people. You can pay for them in a chunk of smaller bites with Falcon 9, which makes perfect sense, by the way. Falcon 9 is sized perfectly for the market that we know. Starship is sized for the market that we don't know. And there may be that market there. We simply don't know. So it's a huge risk, but that's what Elon Musk does. So I hope I'm wrong.
Well, or he could just not buy Twitter, and within a year we'd have condominiums on the moons of Jupiter, for that kind of money, if he put it into SpaceX, which does seem to be his favorite hobby.
If you really look at the numbers, you probably don't get there, because, I mean, NASA spends $10 billion a year on human spaceflight. That's a big chunk of change, even for Elon Musk. I don't know if Jeff Bezos is tapped out at $1 billion a year, but human spaceflight, as we do it today, is incredibly expensive. And if you have a rocket which is much cheaper to operate, that obviously changes things. But you're not doing that with 10,000 people working on it.
So you mentioned Kuiper and Blue Origin, and I hope you don't mind answering this question, but Blue Origin's 2 years older than SpaceX, and we're all kind of scratching our heads wondering when we're going to start seeing some of the larger rockets fly. We've seen the New Shepard, which is gratifying, and it's an interesting program, but it's not the big program we've been hearing about for years. And I know they've finished that massive facility out at Kennedy and so forth. When do we start seeing some launches and some business being conducted by them, do you think?
Well, they know. We don't really. Obviously, Blue is very careful about the information that comes out, and so we don't know. But the issues are still the same. It's 70 tons instead of 100 or 150, but you still have to ask the same questions. Is there really sufficient market to support whatever the workforce levels are? I don't even know what Blue looks like in terms of the number of workers and sort of, being able to compute a churn rate for the company. But I suspect they're the same kinds of problems. And we may find out that given the capacity, there's a huge market out there. But historically, with the exception of constellations, the space launch market has been pretty flat over the years. Now, constellations obviously changed that. And there are some real questions about the economic viability of these massive constellations and trying to compete in the marketplace with broadband. right? I mean, we can all, maybe not all of us, but most of us can get a gigabit at home. And if you wanted to pay a little bit more money, you could get a lot more than gigabit speeds. And that's tough to compete with. And so the constellations are going to have to survive on markets that will pay a premium. And so those are mostly remote markets, and they're maybe business to business markets, which is where Kuiper is focused, which seems to make some sense. But yeah, I mean, somewhere under the market is ultimately the fuel that fuels rockets. It's not methane and oxygen. It's money.
That's a T-shirt quote right there. I think. Tariq, you got another question? Because I have a special question that I'm holding for the end of this.
I guess the last kind of question that I have in this vein is you were talking about New Glenn earlier, Rod, the big rocket for in your question to Andy about when they're going to fly. I know that the BE-4 engine that Blue Origin is building has been like a big hurdle for that mission, not just for them, but also for the Vulcan rocket, because ULA, the United Launch Alliance, has picked them for that. But we've got at least 3 big rockets. You've got Starship, you've got Vulcan, you've got New Glenn in the U.S. alone for heavy lift, and Rocket Lab has their new Neutron rocket that they're going to be aiming for medium lift. In Europe, you have a few others that are up and coming. Many of them are taking a page from SpaceX. I'm wondering when that launch market for these new rockets will saturate, and because we've seen a lot of this before in the early 2000s, I want to say, where everyone had an idea for a crewed spaceship during the X Prize days, and then you end up with one at the end.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if this is more to your point of we're not there yet for NewSpace. Is it still that kind of fledging out the people that are going to survive from them, or do the people that we see now, the SpaceX, the Blue Origins, and I guess the newer entries to replace the Atlas rockets at ULA, are they fairly well entrenched to be leaders of the pack for the next 20 years?
So, I mean, the first thing is we already have an overcapacity. So if if the underlying market is 400 tons, we've got a capacity. If you sort of compute what global capacity is, it's like 1,500 tons. And that's before you bring in Starship, before you bring in New Glenn, if you just kind of look at historical launch rates. So there's already an overcapacity there, but that's assuming you have, perfect pairing between payloads and launch vehicles and all that kind of stuff. So as you bring in new launch vehicles, they will be, for a time at least, that capacity will be utilized, could be utilized, let's just say, by the constellations, because the constellations really do have massive upmass requirements. If I could say mass twice in one sentence. And so so the constellations will soak up a lot of excess capacity. And in fact, if everybody launches what they say they're going to launch, and we would have an undercapacity. And so New Glenn and Starship can feed that undercapacity. But then once the constellations are deployed, either you have new constellations coming up, but the replenishment rates are not going to be sufficient to keep even the existing capacity. I think we are going to have a very competitive market. And you'll probably see new entrants coming into the field. Maybe it's going to be New Glenn, maybe it's Starship. And they'll be over time taking the place of other companies like ULA. I mean, right now, ULA is in a pretty strong position with the national security market because they provide a level of service that no one else is really providing. And so they can stay in that market, but it won't be long before if Starship, New Glenn, Neutron, what have you, are successful, that you'll see a shakeout in that market, and it's kind of anybody's guess as to who will stay in the market. But it's going to be a really, really interesting. It's going to be an interesting time because one of the other misconceptions I think is that with reusability, all of a sudden launches are free, and that's not true. I mean, if you look at pick your company. ULA has 2,500 people, SpaceX has 9,000 or something like that. That doesn't change with reusability unless you get rid of the people that are involved in manufacturing, and it hasn't been happening yet. And so still you have all of those costs that need to get spread across every mission. And so if you gave the rocket away for free, you had perfect reusability, you'd still have at least 30, probably 40% of your cost basis that would still be there. So there's sort of a theoretical limit that maybe you can reduce launch costs by 60%, 70%, but it doesn't go much beyond that. And the first stage alone doesn't really buy you all that much. There's more cost in the second stage.
Mm-hmm.
So, Andy, have we missed any questions that are close to the Cosmic Curmudgeon's heart?
Cosmic Curmudgeon has no heart.
Well said, my friend.
I don't know. There's so much to talk about. I do want to say that it's a fascinating time, and there are areas that I get excited about. I mean, I mentioned remote sensing, data synthesis. This is an extraordinarily exciting time. But I will say that as things get more interesting and the money gets tougher, that's when it really pays to be smarter. And that's when entrepreneurs need to understand where they are. And so, that is what I'm trying to do with the programs that I'm working on is trying to make people a little bit better aware of what's real and what's not. Because if it doesn't make sense, it ain't going to make dollars. And by the same token, if it doesn't make dollars, it doesn't make sense. So,
another T-shirt. This is great. So, I want to hear about your foundation work and so forth. But first, I have to ask you to tell my very favorite story. You probably know where I'm going. When I was writing 2019, a book called First on the Moon about the Apollo 11 landing, which is still available at a bookstore near you. You were kind enough to share a story about what you were thinking you were watching your dad walk on the moon, and it was priceless.
Yeah. Well, Tariq actually alluded to it a little bit. So, you have to bear in mind when I was growing up, I grew up in a neighborhood where there were astronauts all over the place. You couldn't swing a dead cat at my school without hitting an astronaut's kid. And so, and actually the house that we lived in was at the end of a cul-de-sac. And so there are 5 houses along our backyard, and 3 of them were astronauts. One of them was Alan Bean. So they were kind of all over the place. And I'm an 11-year-old kid, and my dad is on television in front of 300 million people, 250 or so of which are my classmates. And he's going to do what dads get paid to do, which is embarrass their kids, right? And so I am just convinced that he's going to do something stupid. And so I see him hopping around on the moon. And I know why he's hopping around on the moon, because he's talked to me about, walking doesn't really make sense on the moon. You can't really run. You kind of have to hop. And so he's trying to figure out the best way to get around on the moon. And then there's this cable running out from the LEM to some instrument, and I'm convinced he's gonna hit that cable, trip, and fall flat on his face in front of 300 people, and most importantly, of course, my 250 classmates, and just embarrass the heck out of me. So, that's what it looks like to an 11-year-old kid who's grown up in the middle of the space industry.
And not to mention the rest of the roughly 650 million people on the planet watching or listening on the radio, right? And there goes Buzz taking a flat ball. That wouldn't be good.
They would be worried about him. I would be worried about myself.
Teenage boys never change, do they?
They don't. No.
All right. So if you would, tell us about your foundations and the work that you're doing with them.
Sure. So the Aldrin Family Foundation is it's a foundation which is dedicated to the proposition that kids get excited about space, and if you can bring the excitement of space into the classroom, you can do a lot of good for education. We're not going to transform education, but what we try to do with the foundation is develop products and curricula that could get into the classroom, that become part of the curriculum that teachers are teaching to meet standards and to meet, it's called interest items, but yet we're trying to make it work for the teachers. And so that's really critical for us. We're working in 3 of the 10 largest districts in the country, and we've got a few programs that we're working on. We have these very large moon and Mars maps, which we get kids and teachers on doing really cool things. And one of the really cool things about being on Mars is when you're on Mars, you're there for a long time. And so you've got to figure out how to do everything on Mars that you do on the Earth, but it's a lot more fun when you teach it on Mars. And so we write curricula that are talking about doing everyday things on Mars and turning them into problems of math, of geometry, all kinds of different things. And it's not just about STEM. So we write curricula that has to do with English language arts. The other program, which we're starting this year, where in fact we're just kicking it off, but it'll be rolling into classrooms in Clark County in Nevada, Las Vegas. We're building CubeSats, and we've got a 2-year program to teach kids about space, about working on teams, about engineering. But we really thought that the idea of building a satellite is so compelling that you don't want to just build the satellite and make it just about the satellite. Let's make it about a much broader curricula. And then we've got some other things that we're working on in the longer term, but it's super exciting. And it's always easy to get excited by kids. Well, I may be a curmudgeon about some of the adults. I love the kids, so.
Well, and some of these kids may end up going on to a program like the one you've just started at Embry-Riddle University, right?
Absolutely. But we're trying to get them curious before we get them into space. So the program at Embry-Riddle is going back a couple of years. I actually started a program in space entrepreneurship at Florida Tech, which was fairly small but successful, and it was just it was a summer program designed to sort of match up with engineering degrees, graduate degrees, or MBAs or something like that. But Embry-Riddle offered the opportunity to create a full master's program. And so the program that we're creating there, first of all, it's 100% online, which I'm convinced is really kind of the future of education in many ways, because there's so many things that you can do with online programs. Like, for example, pulling together things from programs like this to provide the students that are going to be a lot more interesting than just listening to boring lectures. The idea is it's a graduate program. So we're taking students that have some experience, have undergraduate degrees. A lot of our students are currently in the space industry or in aviation industry doing operations, and they want to make the transition to space. They want to make the transition from being a sort of engineer in a cubicle to actually being a manager or leader of companies. So we've been operating this is our first year. We've already got 100 students enrolled and another 50 or so waiting in line. So it's been an incredibly powerful start to the program. And the students are still excited, even after they listen to the Cosmic Curmudgeon for a while. They actually, they tell me they come away a lot wiser. And that's a really, really good thing right now. You know, there are plenty of cheerleaders in space, but somebody's got to teach the reality of what's really going on.
Well, I envy kids able to join up with what you're doing, and don't be surprised if one of these days you see me sneaking into the back of the classroom in a little beanie with a propeller on top so I can pretend that I'm 10 years old. What would be the best place for people to go to get more information on what you're doing?
Well, so for the Aldrin Foundation, it's the aldrinfoundation.org. Check out our website, things like that. For Embry-Riddle, you just look for the Master's Space Operations program at Embry-Riddle, and that'll get you started. And look forward to seeing you all.
I'll be there in the back with my graham crackers and milk. Tariq, anything you want to tell us and where we should go to find more about all your incredible activities?
Well, as always, Rod, you can always find the latest and greatest from myself and space.com at the team at space.com. It's not the space bar, it's the actual word. And I'm on the Twitter. That I guess I hear it's a new place where all the new kids hang out. But it's Tariq J. Malik there, where I tweet mostly about space and sometimes about cats and every now and then about my favorite animal, the hippo.
Oh, my God. Okay, very good. And I should mention that if you want more info on any of our headline stories, those are all over at space.com, from where I get the majority of them as well. You can find out more about me and the magazine I edit, Ad Astra, at adastramagazine.com, and my website, pylebooks.com, which I promise to update sometime this year. I want to thank everybody for joining us for another episode of This Week in Space. As always, feel free to send us feedback at twis@twit.tv. New episodes published every Friday on your favorite podcatcher, so make sure to subscribe, review us, and perhaps most importantly, tell your friends, because we like friends. You can always head over to our website at twit.tv/TWIS. See you next time.
Listeners of this program get an ad-free version if they're members of Club TWiT. $7 a month gives you ad-free versions of all of our shows, plus membership in the Club TWiT Discord, a great clubhouse for TWiT listeners. And finally, the TWiT Plus feed, with shows like Stacy's Book Club, the Untitled Linux Show, the Giz Fizz, and more. Go to twit.tv/clubtwit, and thanks for your support.